The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
The annual film extravaganza known as TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, closes this weekend. And if there's an upside to this year, it's that you don't need to be in town to take part. And to that end, tonight, featured director Mira Nair talks to Nam Kiwanuka about bringing a cherished novel, A Suitable Boy, to the screen. Then we'll hear from our Ontario hubs on what Indigenous journalists aspire to in telling stories from their communities. And from the state of film production in the province to the problem of childcare today, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, September 18th, and that's all ahead on the agenda.
Her work includes influential films such as Monsoon Wedding, Mississippi Masala, and Salam Bombay. It's storytelling that's local and universal all at once. Filmmaker Mira Nair's newest work, A Suitable Boy, closes this year's Toronto International Film Festival. It's a captivating BBC miniseries based on Vikram Seth's epic novel of the same name. And we're delighted to speak to Mira Nair from her home in New York City. Oliota Nyebo. It's really nice to speak to someone from Uganda. But before we talk about A Suitable Boy, we do have a little clip of the series. Sheldon, could you please roll?
No one can be sure of what the future will be.
You will marry a boy I choose.
I don't think I ever want to get married. India is a free country now.
Your sister, my brother. I'm supposed to be next.
Who is he, this boy you have been seen with? We should follow our own heart.
Nobody ever meant anything to me till I met you.
His obsession with that woman. Have you no shame at all?
He's a Muslim, Lata.
Your family will be against him.
One day I will make you proud.
I am determined. I won't give up until I found my Lata suitable boy.
Wow, what an incredible series, and it's closing this year's Toronto International Film Festival. You waited a long time to adapt Vikram Seth's book into film. Why was this piece of writing important to you?
Well, I've loved Vikram's A Suitable Boy pretty much since the day it was written. You know, it's set in 1951, an era where India was independent now, 3-4 years. Actually, the same year my parents got married and moved to a different part of India. That was Nehru's India, is to make it as secular as possible. So if you were from the north, as my parents were, you were posted way east or somewhere far. And it was all about creating a new country in freedom, a strong and ancient culture, but also bewildered by the English being there for more than 100 years, finding out who we are. And that's what Vikram did, I think, so exquisitely in A Suitable Boy. It's a vast tale of 4 elite families at that time, and each, you know, trying to find out who we were. But at the heart of it is a 19-year-old, 20-year-old Lata's story, this young woman whose mother is determined to find her a suitable boy, and determined for her not to fall in love with the Muslim boy that she is in love with. Being a Hindu post-partition, when India was divided between, you know, Pakistan and India, and these are tensions that we were still living with, we continue to live with, and how this mother traverses India, literally looking for a suitable boy for her unmarried daughter. So it's a epic tale, very personal but very political, and that is what I loved about it. It looks at us unflinchingly, but with a great amount of humanity and love and sexuality and mischief and all the things I also love. So it took a long time to get made, because people don't finance sagas with brown folk in it. for a long time. And 25 or more years later, after the novel was written, I heard it was being made again by the BBC, and I just had to direct it.
Well, I mean, it's a story to tell for years to come. The fact that you completed it during a global pandemic. Now, you've described A Suitable Boy as the Indian War and Peace. What did you mean by that?
Well, not literally, but just because it's such an epic tale that talks about a time when a country comes into its own. Again, an epic political canvas, but at its heart, a human story of people and old friendships and new borders and how we traverse. In that sense, it's like a Chekhov novel, like a War and Peace, like those sagas. But Vikram tells it with very much the language and the poetry and the music and the culture of modern India.
Well, the book is a whopping 1,300 pages long. I'm guessing you must have experienced some challenges in trying to adapt that into film. What were those challenges?
Well, I must say, when I entered to direct The Suitable Boy, Andrew Davies, a master screenwriter who had in fact done War and Peace and Les Miserables for the BBC, had already adapted 8 hours of The Suitable Boy. That was the scripts that I got and read, and I thought they were masterfully distilled. When I started working with him, I brought politics more to the fore and less made it a Pride and Prejudice, like which boy will she marry? That is, of course, the fun of it, and that is the story of it, but it is a story that is inextricably bound as India goes preparing for its first national election in 1952, and the country is asked to vote for the first time, the people, for their own. And so for me, it was an equation between the young girl, Lata, and the country, India, each finding itself as they moved towards this new moment of a democratic, free country.
You say that you brought politics to the fore. Why did you do that?
Well, what I'm inspired by, even through my childhood and seeing my parents and that society in early 50s really believe in this extraordinarily syncretic, plural, multiple, secular nation. That was the India that we fought for and we wanted to create, and Nehru really set off on creating. That India is quite different from the India we are confronting now, where borders are much more, are being erected, real schisms between the Hindu and Muslim communities. That intertwining, which is our strength and our plurality, is being obliterated. And this is something that I think is just not the heart of who we are. And I wanted to very much hold a mirror, as Vikram does in The Suitable Boy, to that time when, despite the horrors of partition, despite the bloodshed, despite the tension that created India and Pakistan, there were still a great syncretism between Hindu and Muslim cultures, between our music, our poetry, our language, our struggles, and our friendships, most of all. So in Suitable Boy, the old friendship between the Nawab Saab and Mahesh Kapoor, the Minister of Land and Revenue, is a friendship that I grew up around and that is very much equally Indian in both parts, but now quite rarely seen or not spoken of in the same way. And that's just the least of it. The culture of the courtesan, for instance, which is so sort of eloquently written, and I hope done justice to in the film, played by one of our legendary stars, Tabu, who is reclusive and hardly ever appears. She is Saida Bai, and she sings the language of the great poets of Ghalib, of Daag, of Mir, of the Urdu sort of great refinement of poetry and song, which again you hear, but you don't hear in the same way that we were raised in. And just the fact of the temple, being built in front of the mosque, what has just happened in Babri Masjid's demolition and the creation of the new Ram temple, is also a storyline, in fact, in Suitable Boy, and uncannily like truth. And these are moments in time that are happening and that and that I didn't certainly want A Suitable Boy to be like a museum piece of back then, a sort of a pleasant trip down memory lane, but much more a mirror to where we came from and where we are heading.
Well, you mentioned Mira a couple times, and I wanted to quote something that you said. Just to reiterate, the series is set in the early 1950s, just after the partition of British India into India and Pakistan. And you've said, and I quote, "I wanted people to watch A Suitable Boy and understand that it is a mirror to what we're facing today with the repressive nature of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government. You can choose to emphasize those parallels, or you can choose not to, and I very much chose to." You mentioned some of those parallels. Were you concerned at all with potential backlash you might receive back in India?
Well, I hope that our, I know I see it all the time, a sort of quietening, of anyone who, or even the misunderstanding of the right to speak. I am concerned. It is my home and it is my place, but I hope that I will always, have a home there, because equal to holding a mirror is a lot of love and great admiration for who we are as a culture and as a people. So I certainly hope that I will not be seen as somebody on the other side.
Do you also hope, because watching this series, I kind of knew about the partition, but I didn't really know the details. It's not something that was taught in our history classes. Do you hope that people will become more curious about this and learn more about that part of India's history?
Yes, I mean, of course, a film can just transport you into that time and that tale, but I certainly hope people will want to know more. At the same time, though, I really resist making films that feel like homework and that make you want to learn so too much. I just want to take you away, and at the same time as taking you away, to make you see yourself on screen, to relate to that. And then, yes, of course, to open several doors to find out really why are we where we are. I mean, I find that very powerful, to have our culture, our language, our people who look like us on screen, because that is the power, really, of storytelling. And it's been a long time when we have not seen our stories on screen.
Well, just to follow up on what you were just saying with representation, it bears mentioning that this is the first BBC period drama with a cast consisting entirely of people of color. There's been a lot of discussion about diversity and representation in film in recent years. What is the value of seeing characters, and especially protagonists, that look like you?
Well, that is a very strange way of describing A Suitable Boy as the first time people of color on screen, because, hey, wake up. This is a story of people who look like us. And yeah, you can call it people of color, but it is a story about India, and here we are. Why cast it elsewhere? Why not cast it where it's supposed to, where it's come from, So I find it slightly bemusing that it's the first time people of color. I think it's, wake up, it's about time. If you elect these stories to happen, then they have to be told properly, with those who have been its heartbeat. So, Nam, I have been doing this for 30 some years, always been the peculiar odd one, who's not, who's throwing several languages. Like Indians, we speak Punjabi, English, Hindi, and English all in one sentence. That was the language of one of my films, Monsoon Wedding. The namesake is a smattering of Bengali, English mixed with American, because that is what we are, And so, it amazed me, to be able to see that finally, within few years of making films, like when I opened Mississippi Masala, that was exactly 30 years ago, an interracial romance between an African-American man and an Asian woman. In fact, now they joke and say Mississippi Masala is Kamala Harris, is the embodiment. She is the embodiment of that romance. But then it was completely radical, more than it is now, or it's equally radical now. But the power of seeing ourselves on screen is beyond words, because it gives people the ability to dream that they too have a story and they too matter. And they are not the other, because so many of us have come from elsewhere and have come into a place where people don't look like us and sound like us, but they dream like us. We are the same in so many ways. So, but always being that person, to be not the first only, but also even with Suitable Boy, the budgets for people like us, even however magnificent and sweeping they may be, are not the budgets for the crown, as I always say, But still, my work is to not let you see my struggle, is to take you away, is to sweep you into something that actually you will see yourself in, beyond these patinas of layers of color of this or that or the other. The human heart is the human heart. The human struggle is the human struggle. So that's what I do, or try and do. But it's really about time that we as a world are waking up to this, because it's been terrifically lonely so far.
Well, you mentioned Mississippi Masala, and that was 1989. And when you just said that it's equally radical now to have, say, a black man opposite a South Asian woman. So you did this in 1989.
1991.
1991. Okay.
Yeah,
so, but you've been in Uganda since 1989, right?
Yes, that's when I went to research it. And then fell in love with Uganda and my husband, and have lived there ever since. So the movie came out in 91, but the process started in 89.
But you did that back then. And I remember watching the movie, and I remember a little bit of the backlash. I didn't really understand it. Why did you do it then? If other people are doing it now, I'm assuming that you must have received so much negativity back then. And times are different now. I think you can find a broader community, a global community, but back then, not so much.
Well, I did it. There's no timetable to, why you do things. At least I don't have one. But I did it because it was something, as a brown person. I came from India on a scholarship to study at Harvard. I was a brown kid in the middle of a black and white community, and I was invisible and accessible to both, in a way. And that hierarchy of color, as I saw it, that between being brown, between black and white, was something that intrigued me, in my own personal experience. And that led me to making Mississippi Masala years later, So I didn't have a timetable. It was something that I have myself gone through. And in the Ugandan expulsion, in Idi Amin's expulsion of 1972, when he just gave 90 days to all Asians to leave a place that they had known and lived in as their home for 3 or 4 generations, like my husband's family, for instance, suddenly expelled to different refugee camps across the world. Many of them, oddly, came to Mississippi, and bought these dirt poor motels, and started, the Ugandan exiles really began to own Mississippi motels, which I thought was a strangest trick of history, because Mississippi, as we know, was one of the birthplaces of the civil rights movement. And I thought, here is an African American community that have never known Africa as their home, and here is an Asian African community coming in that have never known Asia, never known India as their home. Africa was home, East Africa in this case. And what if the borders crossed? That was the premise I began with. And actually, to correct you, it was not faced with a lot of negative publicity. In fact, it was a commercial success, especially with Denzel Washington and Sarita Chowdhury in her first role, very incendiary chemistry between them and so on. It was quite a success. The criticism came from the Indian community, in this country, who felt threatened that I was encouraging their daughters to marry. They came up to me on subways and they would say, "What do you think, that every black man is Denzel Washington? Why don't you make films on us?" They would say, "I'm a doctor, I have a Porsche, here's the film." I said, "I need to sell tickets. The minute you're interesting, I'll be there." But yes, that type of criticism. But generally, it was actually, Nam, one of the first portraits of what they called hybridity of the biracial, of the interracial, union and that idea, And for me, what was really astonishing, living 6 months in Mississippi, with my writer Sunita Arapurwala and, doing research and so on. What was interesting was the incredible commonality between the Indian families and community and the African American community there. The getting together, the cooking together, the religion that was so important, the places to hold each other tight were actually the same. But ne'er the twain could meet, except for commercially, and it was it's very interesting and quite the same, I would say, even now.
What was it like to work with Denzel Washington?
Oh, he's consummate, he's a consummate actor and just so deeply comfortable in his skin, in front of the camera, out of the camera. Of course, now he's a wonderful director too, and we have a different kind of friendship of colleagues. Then he had just won the Oscar, although he had just begun in his life as a career. And I had made one film, Salam Bombay, which was quite a hit, but just one film. And I remember I made Mississippi Masala in a kind of stupor of love myself. I had just fallen for my husband, and I was really knew what that was feeling like. And I was not quite getting it from Denzel's character in Mississippi Masala with Sarita. And I remember psyching myself outside his trailer in the cotton fields of Mississippi saying, how do I tell this guy, that to make me feel like I feel? And I went into his trailer and I said, Denzel, you're just consummate. You can do the, industrious big brother. You can do the noble son. You've done everything just perfectly. He said, yeah, get to the point. And I said, but, it's this weak need love, baby. That
you want to bring the fire.
I'm in a stupor and you need to get me to feel that stupor. He looked at me and he said, and I said, let me just tell you that the women and the men, but if you show me that vulnerability, that surrender, then we're going to have an interactive audience. They're going to swoon for you. And somehow that lit a bulb in him.
Well, you talking about, we only have a few more minutes, and I want to get a couple more questions in. But you actually, speaking of Uganda, you started a free film school called Maisha Film Lab for inspiring filmmakers in East Africa. What prompted that?
Well, I'm so happy and thrilled about Maisha, which is a Swahili word, as you must know, which means zest for life, which is the name of our free school, now 16 years old, and about 800 alumni.
Including some
including some lovely stars like Lupita Nyong'o's first film was made in Maisha, and many of the greatest filmmakers in the world have taught there as mentors, from Abdurrahman Sissako to Vishal Bhardwaj to so many people who've just come and offered their services to us, because I still believe that people want to do good. You just have to create places where they can. So I was part of a very extraordinary group of founding members who created Maisha 16 years ago, because there was hardly anything that was being created out of the African continent at that time. And anytime there would be stories few and far between in the out of Africa zone, or white mischief about, a white woman having a neurotic breakdown in Kenya with a Maasai warrior, nameless and faceless in the background. Those kinds of stories would come to me because I lived there, because I had a whatever history there, whatever. And I would look at these stories that had nothing to do with the dignity and the everyday quality and the real power of where I lived. The extraordinary spirit of the people, the wisdom, the philosophy that I was constantly around, and the fact that despite, in some senses, having nothing, they were completely full of humor and wisdom and how to make it, how to keep going. This was not the stories I was looking at on screen. So this is what prompted the creation of the film school in Maisha, to create one's own stories, one's own way, but at the highest level of craft and excellence. And now I think that we have, really created a local film culture across the eastern countries, across Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda. And now there are more than, at last count, we had 28 feature film directors who were considered, who are alumni and who now mentor at Maisha themselves. I'm, in fact, thinking of now making it a more of a community space rather than a filmic space, because the filmic space has already taken root and it's quite wonderfully established.
Well, as someone who grew up in what people call slums, it was a change to see joy and community watching Queen of Katwe. Was that intentional?
Queen of Katwe is so utterly true to the spirit and to the streets of Katwe in Kampala. And the story of Fiona Mutesi is utterly true. I mean, Fiona sold water for a living till she was 11. She learns how to play chess in a return for a bowl of porridge, and she becomes a grandmaster in the years to come and takes her family out of the slum into this house for which I actually planted the garden outside Kampala. And it's extraordinary and real. And I was trying, because I've lived there now so many years, I was mining all that I enjoy and know between the fashion and the style and the slang and the humor, but creating a spirit of how to play the fool, how to make a safe space. So the kids, who are essentially, in some senses, playing themselves, like they did years ago in Salam Bombay, my other film on street kids in India. They're playing themselves in part, but they're also from the streets in any case, like in the story. And they created such an extraordinary dialogue with the likes of Lupita Nyong'o and David Oyelowo, who are like Hollywood stars, but gratefully from the continent. So they really know, they also are sons and daughters of Africa in that sense. So that beautiful dialogue is what makes a Queen of Katwe, just become more than itself, because it's coming from a place of truth, but in the hands of people who have lived that truth and who have the skill and talent, including Robert Katende, the great coach who teaches Fiona chess. And all these people, the real people and the people playing them, were all together in this. That is why the end of Queen of Katwe, I introduced both of them. So you see that it's not a period film. It's a film that is now. Fiona was young and she still is, But it's a beautiful film that that deeply affected and is proven to affect education around the continent of the whole continent, because it has it inspires young African kids to show that you can do it yourself. You do not need that white savior. You do not need someone coming in from the outside to tell you, how to make that chess move. And it's so much about teachers. It's so much about people who lift us from where we are and make us see what could be ahead. And that is the great gift of a person like Robert Katende, who is right from Katwe, who's essentially never left.
Mira Nair, I would love to talk to you for another 30 minutes, but unfortunately we've run out of time. We have 30 seconds left. What is some of the stuff that you're working on right now?
Well, I am working on getting a suitable boy seen across the world right now. I'm also deeply immersed in the reading of this extraordinarily iconoclastic great artist from India called Amrita Shergill, whose paintings have inspired me for years. And she's basically she's India's greatest modern artist, and no one really knows about her beyond the few. And I'm seeking to make a film about her life and her tragic death, and most of all, her extraordinary art. That's what I'm doing, but mostly recovering from the insatiable boy.
Mira, Webele, Enyo. Thank you so much.
Come home to Kampala, Chuanuka.
Thank you so much.
Indigenous journalists across this province are eager to cover the stories of their communities and beyond, but there are challenges inherent to capturing the big picture. Shelby Lisk is our Ontario Hub's journalist covering Indigenous issues, and she joins us now from Ottawa on her recent series of articles looking into that. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Jan.
So your recent series looked at how you participated in this Indigenous-led training program that you took part in March. What can you tell us about that, and why did you find it so valuable?
So the program is called the Indigenous 150 Plus program, and it's a podcast and leadership training program for youth up to the ages of 28. So that's me, and I just squeaked in there. And it was created by Joanne Fishburne of Good Influence Films. So it grew out of a film and conversation series that she was running, where they would bring important Indigenous films to communities, and then afterwards they would have these moderated Q&As, and they really wanted youth to be leading those discussions, but they wanted to set youth for success. So they created this program so they could teach them those skills to moderate. So, interviewing skills, for example.
So, the question is, you're a working journalist. Why did you feel like you needed to get involved in a program like this?
Yeah, so I think that was Joanne's big question too when I applied and I was talking to her about it. I'm a working journalist and I've learned a lot of those technical skills, but what was really missing from my journalism education was, conversations around how to work with Indigenous communities in respectful ways. And I really just wanted a space where I could talk to other people who really cared about that and learn as much as I could from them as well.
Now, in this program, you, of course, were working on putting together a podcast at the end of it. But what I found interesting was in this program, it's not just Indigenous participants, it's also non-Indigenous participants. What was that conversation like?
Yeah, so we had participants from all across Canada. So there were people from, New Brunswick to BC up to Nunavut. And so we really all brought different experiences and backgrounds to the conversations. And so everybody was very respectful of each other, and it felt like a really safe space to ask questions, and there was no stupid question, and we were all just very honest with one another. And so we were able to talk about serious issues like systemic racism, but then we also were able to have these conversations that I don't think Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have. Like we talked about, should non-Indigenous people be learning Indigenous languages? Right. And, how do you get a name in your culture? How do you introduce yourself in your language? So, I was even really able to learn from all the people across Canada in places I've never been to before.
Very interesting. Now, for this series, you also interviewed a few Indigenous media professionals about their experiences. What were some of the common threads and themes from those discussions?
So I think the two most common themes in the conversations that I had was about representation and about responsibility. So the conversation around representation was really about, what stereotypes and dehumanizing language and imagery do we still see in Indigenous stories in media? And, the journalist that I interviewed, she shared a story with me that just really stuck with me. And she was saying when she was studying journalism at Humber in Toronto, she remembers there was a conflict going on back near her home community, which is Six Nations in Caledonia. So not too dissimilar from what is actually currently happening right now. And she said she was listening to the news about it, and, they kept talking about the dispute as the people versus the natives. Mm-hmm. And so, she's sitting there with her peers, and they're all learning in journalism school about how important language is and the words that you choose. And they're sitting there and saying like, oh, well, I guess, Kelly, you're not a person by this definition. And so those are the kinds of things that we're telling Canadians. But, even what I think is even more sad is those are also the kinds of things that we're feeding, Indigenous youth about how they're valued in this country.
Right. Now, one of the other conversations you had was with a historian, and she explained kind of the historical reasons for way newsrooms deal with Indigenous issues. Can you share some of her insight?
Yeah, so that was Carmen Robertson, and she shared with me, that newspapers really got their start more so in Europe and in the United States before coming to Canada. But when newspapers were opened here, they were usually opened by settlers who came from those countries and those regions. And so when they came over, they sort of came already with these ideas about objectivity in journalism, which we now know, to be skewed. And they also already came with these prejudices and, racist ideas about people of color or people who look different from them. And so because these ideas were already so entrenched in their mind, it obviously translated into the media, into the journalism that they were creating. And then that sort of creates this feedback loop you know, where your opinion is just being solidified by the media. And that's sort of been this feedback loop that's been going on for, you know, over 150 years now.
This is a very, very interesting thought there. In one of your interviews, you spoke to Megan Fowler of Journalism for Human Rights and talked about the importance of newsroom training. Of course, we've, across Canada, newsrooms received training, but for people who are not familiar with what that looks like, can you explain what that looks like and what some of the takeaways Megan Fowler explained?
Yeah, so she said that when JHR, they'll go into a newsroom, or sometimes they'll also go into schools, journalism schools, and talk to students. And, you know, they always start by going over, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, and going over those calls to action and, you know, specifically what media's role is within those. And then they will usually go into a little bit of history about the Indigenous communities that are around, you know, where they're giving the presentation, and they'll talk a little bit about terminology and, you know, harmful stereotypes, and look at stories and sort of discuss them, you know, amongst the group, you know, what could be harmful in this and what is good about it.
She did say that it was kind of a relief for Indigenous journalists as well. Talk about that, kind of the burden as well, you know, for Indigenous journalists being in that newsroom, sometimes being the only voice.
Yeah, so she did really stress to me that, you know, part of the reason why JHR does this is to sort of relieve that burden from Indigenous journalists, so that we can enter the newsroom and feel like we can tell stories about what we care about, and, you know, we can do our job without also having to be, you know, the Indigenous expert on the side. But she also really stressed to me as well that, you know, many newsrooms or schools might think, you know, we've done this training and now we can check it off the list. But she really doesn't want people to think that when JHR comes in. She wants them to know that this is one step in a journey, that in a learning process.
You also spoke to a working journalist, and you got quite personal in that Q&A. And I imagine it was kind of a unique experience for you as an Indigenous journalist interviewing a fellow Indigenous journalist. What was that experience like?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm really lucky in my job because I mostly get to interview Indigenous people, which is really nice. And there's always that, you know, that sort of everyone relaxes when we have that something in common. And so it was even more like that when interviewing an Indigenous journalist. And, you know, it really helps to feel like you're not alone. And so I left a lot of the back and forth in our Q&A, which I maybe usually wouldn't do, because I really wanted people to see that, you know, this isn't just this one journalist experience. You know, this is a very common experience, and this is happening to a lot of us. So there was lots of things that we shared in common. And, you know, one thing that we talked about for a while is that, you know, we're both Mohawk. We're both from Mohawk communities in Ontario. So she's from Six Nations and I'm from Tyendinaga. And so both of our communities have been in the news this year quite a bit. And we both talked about our hesitation and our fear and the responsibility of reporting in our own communities and how that kind of stopped us, you know, from reporting on those things.
My last question to you is, you know, after the work you did on this series, what's the main message you hope media organizations take away?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, we all kind of recognize now that we need more Indigenous voices in media, but I think that we also have to look at we need Indigenous people in all levels of media organizations. So in decision-making roles as well, in editor positions, producer positions, you know, CEO positions. So we can really see that structure change. And I ended my essay with a quote from Jesse Wente when he was talking about diversity in the newsroom. And he said, you know, just being in the newsroom doesn't cut it. What we need is the walls of that newsroom to come down so the room doesn't even exist anymore. So what I get from that is that he's really talking about an entire restructuring. And I think that that's what we need to see happen.
Shelby, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. That's Shelby Lisk, our Ontario Hub journalist covering Indigenous issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The agenda this week learned why the stock market can be booming while the economy isn't, and took stock of childcare in the province. The agenda's Week in Review begins looking at how Ontario's film and television industry is faring in this COVID-19 era.
You have to have production insurance to make a show. And anyone who was in production or who was close to production had an insurance policy that would cover them even in the case of a COVID outbreak. But any new productions who didn't already have COVID insurance, insurance companies are now imposing COVID exclusions on them. That's basically the equivalent of having car insurance that doesn't cover you for a car accident. So for the majority of shows, insurance isn't a nice to have, it's a must have because of the way we make the shows. So I'll give you an example. If you have a COVID exclusion and you try to go to camera and your star goes down, let's say we're talking about a big scripted drama, and your star goes down and that star goes down for a couple of weeks, you're shutting production down for weeks. And there's hundreds of thousands of dollars associated with that shutdown that can't be reimbursed. And on top of that, we've got hundreds of thousands of dollars in COVID costs for all the new people that had to be hired, all the new protocols that had to be implemented, all the equipment that had to be purchased. All of this stuff is just dollar sign, dollar sign, dollar sign. And it all adds up. And if those two things are not dealt with, a lot of productions will not be coming back.
I do want to follow up on this, but let me just, let's take a moment here just to give our viewers a sense about the kind of money that we're talking about, because this is one of the most significant economic drivers in the province of Ontario. Sheldon, maybe you could bring these numbers up. This is for 2019. It was a record-breaking year for film and television production in the province of Ontario. North of $2 billion spent on productions, 343 productions, basically one for almost every day of the year. That counts to 44,540 direct and spin-off jobs. It was a 15% increase in production from 2018, and it meant 7,500 new jobs for Ontarians. We know that 2020 is not going to look anything like that. Cynthia, do we yet have, or I guess do you have any sense about how much smaller the numbers are going to be when you look on December 31st back at 2020?
Well, they're not going to look like that, that's for sure. We know that between March and June, we lost over $700 million in spending, so that money won't be spent this year. We aren't as fast getting up to speed like we were. You mentioned, we had 343 productions last year, almost one for every day of the year. Right now, we have 15 shows that are shooting, so a big difference. At this time last year, we would have had 50 shows this week shooting, so a more than 50% decrease. It does kind of depend on if we can find an insurance solution and how fast those productions can get back to work. We are hoping to see a lot of people back to work by October, November, but it will be a greater than 50% decrease for sure.
Okay, Alistair, I should give you a chance now to come back on some of the points that Marla made, namely the issue of can you really get back into production if you can't get COVID insurance for your biggest stars, et cetera, et cetera?
There are definitely going to be a couple of shows that we don't see return in 2020. But what we have also now picked up is a bunch of producers who have never produced for film, television, or digital media before. And those folks are the theater producers, and they are charging ahead. So while we are only seeing 15 to 20 big productions shooting on the streets right now, for my members, for the Actor Toronto membership, they're actually now working at a good level. We are still way off of 2019, way off. But we've now suddenly invited all of these new producers to the table as well, who are now streaming theater into the digital world, which engages the services of performers, which is my membership, which is good for everyone.
Cynthia, does Film Ontario have any advice or recommendations for production companies in terms of dealing with this insurance issue?
I would never give an individual producer some advice, I'll tell you that. But I mean, each production has to do a risk assessment on their own particular production. So productions range in size, as Alistair was saying, from very small. They may be comfortable taking on that risk if they only have a 3 or 4 day shoot and aren't risking a 2-week shutdown. For the series that don't have coverage, Marla laid it out perfectly, they can't absorb that type of financial hit. And in addition, their investors aren't going to believe that they can finish their show without the insurance in place. So they're not even going to have access to the money to absorb the hit if it happens. So the advice is to help us out in making the argument to government that some sort of insurance solution needs to happen, and to keep looking at solutions. As Marla also said, we're a very creative industry, and we do come up with creative solutions.
Frances, is the stock market supposed to be an indication of the health of the economy in general?
Well, no, and sometimes it gets played that way because the better the economy is doing, the better companies will do. I have two roles. I'm both an economist and a strategist, and the reason I'm employed by people who manage money is to give you a GDP forecast. How will the economy do? Why? Because over the long run, that's our best guess of how companies' earnings will do over that period. So there is a relationship between them. But what we have to remember is that really the companies within our markets are not the same division as they are over our economy as a whole. So typically, you're not going to find people saying, well, the economy is doing well, I'm going to invest in the TSX. You're going to hear people more saying, I like Canada's energy sector, therefore I will buy energy stocks. Now, that's not to say that there's nowhere to invest in Canada if you want to make a play on the economy. Usually our Canadian bond market and the Canadian dollar have a much closer relationship than the stock market. There is a link, but it's really not as simple as saying the stock market is the economy. That's just not factually what's happening here.
No, for sure. And Brian, maybe you could follow up in this regard. You know, one could understand the public being confused about that because on the one hand, they see the markets doing reasonably well. And on the other hand, we just experienced the biggest shrinking of the Canadian economy on record since StatsCan started keeping records almost 60 years ago. Why is there such a large disconnect at this particular juncture?
Well, because the drivers in the market, especially in the U.S. market right now, are the big tech giants, and there are 5 or 6 of them. And they're dominating market conditions, and people are betting heavily on them. I would say too heavily on the fact that they're innovative, they've done very well even during the pandemic, and that their prospects in the future still look terrific because they basically have monopoly power in their sector. That is not the economy. If you look, in fact, even at the S&P 500, which is supposed to be a fairly broad index, the 5 biggest companies in that index are Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet. Those are the, and Facebook, those are the giant companies. Those 5 companies account for about 1/5 of the entire S&P earnings. So it's not balanced, and that doesn't tell you very much about how the economy as a whole is doing. How we know that retail is struggling, energy stocks are in trouble. We know that the bulk of the economy is not doing nearly as well as these 5 tech giants.
In which case, Frances, why don't the people who run these exchanges feel more of an obligation to include companies that are more representative of what the broader economy is actually doing?
Well, they may have the push towards doing that, especially because this representation has changed so dramatically. But let's also remember that the company is listed in, let's say, the S&P 500. They're really biased towards manufacturing sides of the economy, industrial and tech, whereas the things that affect your and my life on the day-to-day, things like services and jobs, are not represented there. So I'm not sure that we need to say we need to change the system. What we need to do is recognize that when someone says, buy a diversified portfolio, buy the S&P 500. Sure, it's more diversified than buying one stock, but 1/5 of what you own is big tech. So what we have to do first is really disabuse ourselves of the notion that when you buy an index, you're buying the broad economy. You certainly are not. Like I said, if you want to make a big bet on what you think the economy is going to do, zero in on why you think that's going to happen. Now, I will say on the flip side that if you had told me before, back in January, we're going to have a really bad pandemic and everyone's going to have to stay home and do their interviews with the agenda over their phone using high-end internet, they're going to have to work from home, buy their groceries online, what would I have invested in? I would have bought tech stock. It makes perfect sense. In the United States, I would have bought healthcare stocks, which are 15% of that index. Are we really saying that, sure, there's probably a divide between what these companies should be and what they shouldn't? But effectively, it makes a lot of sense to, I think, most people that tech companies and those that are affiliated with a pandemic and work from home are doing really well. And those like airlines and casinos are doing really poorly. When you put it in terms like that, does it really seem so disconnected?
No, that makes perfect sense the way you've just described it. But then, okay, well, Brian, why don't you help us by following up and track sort of the development of the tech stocks on the markets, how they have changed the composition of the exchanges over the last, let's say, 3 decades. What have you seen?
Well, it's much more recent than that. I mean, we saw the tech boom in the 90s, which collapsed. But in the 90s, the S&P was a much broader index. It had different sorts of companies in it, and these tech giants hadn't reached the level they have today. And we're talking now, 2 of them are trillion-dollar companies. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. But over the last decade, they've increasingly become more and more dominant. And once they entered the Dow Jones index, they began skewing that index as well in the same way. But if you leave them out, then you're leaving out the key drivers of the current market.
Childcare largely pays for itself as an investment. And one of the things that's really interesting coming out of the sort of Quebec experiment, if we want to call it that, is that one of the significant results of it has been a significant increase in women's labor market participation and a concomitant decrease in levels of child and household poverty. So as an illustration, in between 1997 and 2016, the labor force participation rate of mothers in Quebec of children aged 0 to 5 increased by 16 percentage points, from 64 to 80%. And elsewhere in Canada, the increase was just 4 points, from 67 to 71%. So we see that those kinds of public policy investments have significant impacts both on labor market participation, but also on the downstream effects. They're on taxation levels increase, so governments get more money, including, hilariously, the federal government actually has done quite well out of the taxation revenue generated by women's labor market participation in Quebec. But we also see really important child development outcomes. So it's a system that for every dollar invested yields more than double in returns.
Elizabeth, let's do another comparison, and this time not to a province like Quebec, which is not dissimilar from Ontario in terms of size and makeup and so on. Let's do Northwest Territories. That's pretty different from Ontario. What did you find there when you looked at the NWT?
Looking there, it's a different place in Ontario and Quebec. The same story is that it's a really good investment to put money, government money, into childcare. Specifically in the Northwest Territories, when we looked at it, it was actually a better deal for the government to invest in childcare than mining, diamond mining, one of their huge industries that people are very concerned about, spend a lot of time, political thought about. But actually, if they're going to put $1 into childcare, it's going to be a better deal than $1 into their mining industry. It's a pretty big deal.
We do talk about this subject quite frequently on this program, as recently as just a few days ago when Armine Yalnizyan, who is, of course, a well-known economist and Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers, she and I talked about this. And let's play a little snippet of that conversation, and then we'll come back and chat, okay? Sheldon, if you would.
Childcare is the choke point on recovery. And childcare is treated as a market-delivered system. It, too, is functioning with loss of user fees and higher costs, and more of them will shutter, and we're just standing by, watching this vital social infrastructure collapse because of market forces. So there's some sectors that we actually need to immediately address and prevent further loss in.
Carolyn, can I start by getting you to follow up on that? Why addressing childcare is so essential to a post-pandemic recovery? What's the argument?
Well, as always, Armine just hit the nail on the head. It is essential both to economic recovery and social recovery. And it's important that we tackle it quickly because, as Armine pointed out, the childcare sector right now is very unstable. And we know that here in Ontario, just over half of Ontario's childcare centres have reopened at this point. And what we worry about is that some of those that are still closed may never reopen, right? And it's primarily because, right now, they're temporarily have low enrollment. Now, we know the usual story in childcare is that there are lots of wait lists, that it's hard to get a space, that they're oversubscribed. And right now, we have the opposite situation of very low enrollment, which means childcare centers' deficits are going up, which means that they may close down permanently. But again, we know that's a temporary situation. If we look at, say, emergency room usage, there was a great study from back in the SARS pandemic that showed that it took 2 years for emergency room visits to go back to normal post-pandemic. right? But we never thought, oh, well, I guess we could just let that emergency room close because we know that we would need it, right? But childcare, because it's left to the market, because it's, each individual, sometimes a volunteer parent board, trying to figure out how to keep the doors open. We're just going to stand by and watch the whole sector collapse unless, the province and the federal government wake up and make a strong investment into childcare, understanding that it's essential to our economic recovery and also essential to social recovery. Young children who have been experiencing this pandemic, have had their daily routines upended. They need a strong quality childcare system that can help them look to a brighter future. So I see it as an investment not only in the economy, but also in our social fabric.
That's just some of what we've covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including those conversations in full, you can visit our website, tvo.org, or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. That's it for this Friday, September 18th, 2020. Next week, we'll find out where Canada stands in the race for a COVID-19 vaccine, look south of the border at what deepening divisions there could mean for us here, and meet the voice of Hockey Night in Canada's Punjabi edition. I'm Jan Jagannathan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a good weekend, and Steve, we'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman. And by viewers like you. Thank you.